Good morning. So I'm going to start this off with just talking a little bit about what we're going to be doing. And if we can go to slide 2, all about continuing education. I'd like to start by just suggesting, think of continuing education as a very broad topic. And we would like to even put on the table the possibility of a little bit of a state of mind, that idea about learning continually. And what we're going to do over the next 2 sessions, today and next week on Wednesday, is give you some more specific examples of where you can find continuing education and how to take advantage of it depending on your goals. So let's take a look at what we're going to be talking about today. Specifically, we're going to define what continuing education is and what we believe at least are some of the benefits. Ask the question, is continuing education right for me? And how does it differentiate itself from college? There are a number of ways of thinking about continuing education. We'll talk about some basic types and a little bit on how to pay for it, as we did with college. And then some ideas about where to start when you're trying to figure out how to find classes or training. And then next week, specifically, we're going to zero in more on trades and what a trade job is. So this will focus a little bit more on continuing education for learning a trade. And some of you might be wondering, well, and what is a trade job? Well, we're going to be talking about it as a job that requires specific training, specific skills, but that you probably would not get if you went to college. And a lot more on that next week. We'll talk a little bit about how to decide if this is the right choice for you, where to go to learn a trade, how to pay for it. Again, always an important topic to consider, and then give you also some examples of how to learn a trade. With that, let's go on to the next slide. So continuing education is formal instruction normally. And there are a couple of ways of thinking about continuing education. Many times it's related to getting or keeping a job. So to remain current in your current career or job, continuing education can be very helpful. To develop employable skills, in other words, to develop some capabilities that will help you either get a job or keep the job you have, do a better job with your responsibilities, or possibly even train for a new job. You have something, you do have a job right now, but you'd like to switch, and continuing education can be a way to make that switch. But that's not the only possibility for continuing education opportunity. And there's a number of classes and programs and so forth that really revolve around developing a personal interest. And in some cases, that personal interest can also help you develop additional income streams. So we're going to be talking a little bit about both types of learning experiences. The first has to do with very specifically job-related learning, but there is a more broader context, which is around personal skills, personal interests that may or may not help you find a different job or a job that you like better. And with that, let's move on to the next slide and just pause for a minute and think, what is something that you've learned recently? Just to let's warm us up a little bit about thinking about this idea of continuous education. Something you learned recently, maybe at work, in a class, in a book, a friend told you something that you thought was interesting, you were out on the internet, or you watched a TV program. Those are all examples of ways to learn something. Can anybody suggest something that they learned recently? There's a huge pause while everybody is thinking. Well, obviously, for anybody who's sitting into this work on this workshop, you're engaged in continuing education right now, right? Okay, there's in the chat creating Hey, can you read that for me, Deb? Because I missed
the podcast audio for social media.
Okay.
So that was from Tremaine.
Okay. Anybody else have a quick example?
Yes. Well, when we were doing research for this presentation, I learned a lot about continuing education and trade school that I didn't know.
It looks like Maria was trying to say something. You have a question? You have a statement, Maria?
No, I have an opinion. I recently learned in my class that I need to make friends in English to improve my pronunciations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's an interest, and it's suggesting how could this be helpful for you? And you're suggesting in a number of ways to improve your pronunciation by speaking with friends. Yes.
All right. And then we have another one. I learned about the process of book publishing, and that's from Raul.
Book publishing. And how are you thinking of this helping you, Raul?
I have a book to publish.
You have a book to publish.
Absolutely. This May.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So this is a personal interest, or are you going to make a lot of money like one of those mystery writers?
A little bit of both, hopefully.
Oh, there you go. So there's a great example of a personal interest and a possible stream of money as well. Thank you. Thank you. And Anne and I are thrilled that we now know how to set up a Zoom meeting. So not only can we meet with our students, but we can meet with our friends and our relatives. So it's surprising how many little examples you can find. And that's just the beginning of thinking about continuing education. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, please. Benefits of continuing education. Again, let's focus first on some of those job benefits. The possibility of increasing your chances for promotion. In other words, same job, but working at a higher level. So that's a promotion. Possibility to increase your salary, same job, but if you're doing a better job of it, perhaps your boss is going to say, okay, you deserve more money. You're doing a better job of the job that you have. Continuing education can offer you the opportunity to increase your chances of being able to change the type of job you have, to change careers, or to improve the types of jobs that you can get, depending again on the type of learning program that you're engaged. Is it a little bit different than your current job, or is it a complete switch? And we can talk a little bit about that later. But again, there are also those issues around personal development. Sometimes just learning something new, something that you're interested in, something that you may have a talent for, skills for, is very rewarding, even if it's not going to offer an enormous change in your job circumstances. And that suggests possible improvement in lifestyle, in your personal happiness. And back to Raul's opportunity to sell his books, provide streams of income as well. And There are lots of examples of that, and wonderful, Raul, that you are our first today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Anne.
All right, so a thing to bear in mind is that more education means more opportunity. And Bob just gave us a list of what some of those opportunities are, but very important to keep at the forefront of your mind. More education equals more opportunity. And on the next slide, let's ask ourselves then, is education right for me? Should I be thinking about continuing education? And a way of looking at that is to think, first of all, about your goals in life. So here's some examples of how thinking about your goals might lead you to think, ooh, perhaps I do need some higher education. So a goal might be, and again, this builds a little bit on what Bob just said, I want to be in the same kind of work, but I really need more responsibility. So for example, you might be in a fairly lower kind of job, which isn't paid so well as a nursing assistant, but perhaps you want to become a fully qualified nurse practitioner. Okay, so that's, same kind of field, but much more responsibility and much more pay. You might want a totally different job. You might be in some field right now and it's just bringing you in some income, but it's not really what you want to do with your life. And maybe you have other talents or knowledge in other areas, things that you really would prefer to be doing. So for example, you might be something like a landscaper at the moment. Again, not earning very much money. It's good work, it's decent, but it's manual. Maybe you really, really would like more of a trade. And again, we'll talk about this more next week. Maybe you'd like to become an electrician, right? So that's a very different field of work, much better paid, but it does require some serious study and on-the-job training. Maybe you just have a personal interest that you started doing something. For example, you're a parent of a couple of school-age children, but you really want to become a volunteer at the school, right? So maybe that doesn't require any further education, but maybe it does. Maybe you might even end up being a substitute teacher, right? Once you set along a different path, it can lead to more and more things. And finally, perhaps you'd like really more secure job prospects. Okay, in this day and age, security in our job is a very, very important thing. So we've given you the example of maybe you're a waitress. Again, that's not tremendously well paid. And maybe you want to, do something that really you feel will be a very secure job, a very secure career for your life. So you might have an end goal of wanting to become something like an accountant, right? That's generally considered a very stable job. And maybe you can't leap right from being a waitress to becoming an accountant. Maybe there are some in-between stages. So maybe you want to go back to, some kind of classes, night school, online learning. Maybe you could learn to become a bookkeeper or an accounts clerk first. See how you like that, see whether you still have the interest, and from there go on to becoming an accountant. Okay, so these are just some suggestions, and sometimes there are steps in between, but it is a question of thinking about what you really want out of life and what you feel that you're capable of doing. All right, on the next slide. So also, besides thinking about your goals, think about your skills and your talents, right? Not much point in having a goal of being, say, an accountant if you absolutely detest working with figures, right? If math freaks you out completely, accountancy is not for you. So think about your skills, your talents, things you enjoy doing. Think about what education you have first, what formal education. Do you have a high school certificate? Do you have what's called an equivalency certificate? Like, what level of education do you have? What job experience do you have? And then what are your personal talents? So many times we have other talents which we just consider hobbies, but maybe some of those talents and interests could actually become a career for us. So for example, I know someone who he had a job for a lot of years, and when he was in his 50s, he decided what he really loved to do was cook. So he was doing, some cooking things for the local church, for a couple of local organizations. And he actually decided to go back to community college and get certified in the culinary arts program, which is kind of the cooking program. And he now does a lot of catering. So, he really took an interest. And even though he was older, he decided that interest was what he really wanted to do. So he got some more education, and now he's very happy doing that. So, that also tells you never too late to change. So never too late to think about this. So as a formal education, as I just said, you might have a high school GED. You have in your job experience, how many years you worked, what kind of job you did, whether it had specialized skills. And for your talents and interest, again, things you like to do well, and especially your hobbies. Your hobbies are often a good source of knowing something you really love doing. So on the next slide, again, also think about your resources. So we've thought about our goals, we've thought about what skills and talents we have. Now think about your resources. And there are several critical resources. You have to think about how much time you have. So if you're going to take classes, you're going to need time for those classes. You're also going to need time for homework, studying, and also maybe if it's something practical, you might need time for that practice or lab work or anything else that's a practical skill. You also need the money, and we'll be talking some more about this. You're going to have to pay probably something for the tuition, for materials. So you want to be sure that you can afford that. And it might not have to come out of your pocket, but still in all, it's a cost that you're going to have to be sure that you can meet. Equipment, right? If you're going to take a class, even if it's an in-person class, and certainly if it's an online class, you're going to need to have a good computer, you're going to need to have good internet access. And potentially if you're going to need lab work, or if it's a trade school job, you might need some equipment like tools. Say you're studying carpentry, you're going to need some carpenter's tools. An electrician, you'll probably need some electrician's tools, that kind of thing. So think very carefully about equipment, again, how much it costs and whether you can afford it. And then very importantly for our ESOL students, you need to be sure that you are comfortable reading and speaking in English. Okay, if you're having a lot of difficulty with everyday English, then taking a class with much more advanced vocabulary in a difficult subject matter, that might make life very difficult for you. So certainly while you're thinking about this, be absolutely sure that your English is as good as it needs to be for you to transition to taking these more difficult classes. Okay, so before I turn it back to Bob, let me just ask, does anyone have any questions so far? We'll give you more time for questions at the end as well. But does anybody have anything pressing they would like to ask? If not, back to Bob.
Okay, how is continuing education different from college? Well, here are just a few pieces of information to keep in mind. Continuing education is certainly normally a shorter time frame. And just to use this workshop as an example, it's a 1-hour workshop compared to college, which can be either a 2 or a 4-year program. So the difference the possible difference is a significant range in the amount of time that needs to be committed. Relative to continuing education, normally for the more organized and specific skill programs, you would get a certification. Whereas at college, because the course study is a longer process, what you will normally get at the end of either 2 or 4 years is a specific degree. So certification indicates that you have a certain set of skills to do a particular task. A degree is a broader indication of both skills and perhaps knowledge-based information. So again, there's an enormous number of different programs, but in general, certification is going to be representing a much more specific set of skills that you have mastered. And then finally, continuing education tends to be less expensive. Yes, certification programs can cost money, and sometimes there isn't an enormous number of dollar difference between a class for a certification or a particular degree program, but that certification is only a few classes compared to that 2-year degree or that 4-year degree. So even if the class itself is roughly the same cost, there are fewer classes, which means the continuing education road tends to be less expensive. College, as we pointed out at our workshops last month, can be expensive or even extremely expensive, again, depending on your goal. So with that, let's take a look at what we're calling 4 types of continuing education. Now, these classifications are just a way to help you think in general terms about continuing education. There's nothing magic in the number 4. And you will notice that there's some overlap between these different types of continuing education as you think about what you're trying to learn. First of all, there are the certificate programs. The certificate programs are basically specific sets of classes. They tend to be job focused, and they're offered, these programs, by colleges, community colleges, trade schools, some nonprofits. People take these programs for a number of reasons. They tend to, again, to be job specific. For example, to re-enter a field. If an individual has been out of a particular job for some number of years, or perhaps is transferring from one country to another, so had experience in the home country, but is now in a different place, that individual may want to go back and get a certificate to be able to then re-enter that field, that career field that he or she was in. So that can be a very frequent use of a certificate program. Sometimes people go for a certificate to learn a basic skill. It can be a pharmacy technician, electrician, number of trades offer certificate programs. I knew of one individual, who, for example, who had some experience doing electrical wiring in his home country, was currently living in this country, working in landscaping, and he really, 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 really wanted to be an electrician. Well, this might be an avenue for somebody who has a little bit of experience, so he knows that this is something that he thinks he could do well, but now he needs to go learn those basic skills beyond just the most obvious opportunities that he had when he was just helping somebody out in his home country. And then finally, the possibility of increasing your skill level. You may know a reasonable amount about something. For example, there are plenty of folks who love to work on their cars. However, that will probably not get you one of those higher paying auto technician jobs with some of those big car companies. So this would be an opportunity if you're interested in increasing your skill level and qualifying for those more highly paid jobs, is to go for a certificate program. The second type of continuing education is we're calling individual classes. And this is, yes, certificate programs have classes, but here we're talking about just one class at a time. So for example, whether it's at a community college, a nonprofit, even a museum or online, there are classes, for example, to learn a language like English. Literacy Council offers classes. You don't have to take all of them. You can take one, or you can take two, or you could take a whole number of them to reach a particular goal. But the point is, this is a lot more limited in the sense of the time commitment is more limited, and you pick and choose based on your goals and your interests. Similarly, there are a number of different types of classes around technology, the use of computers, the use of different programming systems, whether it's QuickBooks or Google Suite or Zoom. Some of these classes are quick and simple, an hour or two. Some of them are quite substantial, and sometimes they do end up you can end up with a certificate program, but in general, the point here is that notion of one class at a time, limited, less expensive, also less of a time commitment. And certainly there are the classes that are regarding personal interests. Anne gave that lovely example of cooking and becoming more and more involved in cooking until it translated into a business in and of itself. And if we go on to the...
I have a question in the chat from Maria.
Yes. Could you read it, please?
She wants to know if she can get a different student visa if she's studying in a certificate program.
Get a different...
She's asking, could I renovate a student visa studying in a certificate? Maria, do you want to help us with the question?
Yes, my question is regarding if I have a student visa, if I want to a certificate program, I continue renovate this type of visa.
Renew it? Do you want to keep it going longer?
Yes.
Okay. Melinda, do you know?
I know that in a college, yes, but I don't know if with that certificate program that is possible.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think that's those kinds of questions are better addressed by the school you're interested in applying to. You know, usually when you go in to apply for admission, they ask you what your visa status is, and there are individuals who on campuses like MC, for example, or wherever you're going, that are there in the Office of Admissions and Financial Aid that deal with international students. So that would be the first place I would ask. As far as some of the other types of classes and that are listed on the PowerPoint that Barbara's talking about, I'm not sure, you know, what they would qualify for. But I know in terms of formal colleges and colleges that are accredited, they would be the ones who would say, yes, this works, this doesn't work. But
Okay.
those are definitely questions you want to look at before you engage in enrolling, because you want your visa to remain in effect, and you don't want to start a program, then
Yeah.
your visa might expire on you and then you couldn't complete it. So it's a good question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anything else, or shall we move on? Let's move on.
Please continue.
Me, could I have a question about the community college? It means Montgomery College or some college?
It could be Montgomery College or Prince George's Community College. There are a number of community colleges in this area. So we're speaking in general terms. We're not speaking of any particular community college.
Okay, if I want to take a quick book under accounting program, I need to go to apply the program in the my community college. That it's correct.
You could definitely take that in Montgomery College, yes. It depends where you live. There's 3 branches in Montgomery County. So whether you want to go to the one in Tacoma Park or Rockville or even further north, yeah. You could get any of those. And I would go online and look. Registration for classes for spring will start now. I think the 24th is when spring semester starts.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, let's move on to the next slide and take a look at another type of learning situation. These are formal and informal apprenticeships. And we'll be talking a little bit more about these next week when we're talking about learning a trade. So where do you find information and get this kind of training? Local labor unions, contractors, hospital programs are examples of providing formal and informal apprenticeships. Not the only organizations or companies, but just to give you an idea of where to look. And so these are opportunities to learn on the job. So again, very focused on job training, and people who are interested in these programs, for example, and talked about this idea relative to certification, to a certificate, but to learn from somebody who has experience or skill. So not surprisingly, in hospitals, they are frequently offering different opportunities to learn alongside of a more experienced nurse, for example, in this case. But there are other programs that are also offered in other different types of jobs. So the idea is to use the job specifically as a learning experience, less formal than in a hospital, for example, would be that construction worker who gets a job and the company may not have a specific formal training for this job, but there is a more experienced worker on the crew, and he tends to be the person that you can go to ask the questions, to get a better handle on how to do your job well. So that's an example where it's a little bit, it's not a formal structured learning program, but it's a very good way, and it tends to be well-known way to learn a job. And then, of course, there are opportunities in informal apprenticeships through learning by volunteering. And again, Anne suggested that idea, the parent who may start by volunteering in a school, and perhaps there's a introductory getting to know you kind of training. But as that parent becomes more and more interested in helping out with the school, watching that teacher, that's a little bit of informal apprenticeship, if you will, perhaps even will then switch to a more structured kind of learning, or even volunteer at the Literacy Council and learn more about learning English, for example, would be another example of learning informally, because it isn't a structured classroom kind of situation, but there are people who know more about how to do something, and it's a watch and learn. And then finally, there's what we're calling, and it's a catch-all, independent study. People learn all the time just because they go out and look around. So where can you learn independently? The answer is almost anywhere. Museums, libraries, nonprofits, Montgomery County Recreation Department, online. Anne's favorite, I think, is YouTube videos. It's amazing what you can learn if you just consider, one, what you're interested in, and two, what your goal is, and then you start to sift through different possibilities. Obviously, this is not formal. This is not a certificate. This is not college. This is you exploring, but certainly in this area, in this country, there are an enormous number of options and opportunities, and we're just offering some examples of the way you can explore. And this is a lot more on your own time, probably not terribly expensive, sometimes free. And you have the time, or you engage when you have the time, and you don't participate when you don't have the time. So whether you're trying to learn a language, or you're trying to develop a skill or a hobby, and we're giving you examples of, whether it's English or any other language, and use the example of accounting. Well, you build up a series of experiences over time, possibly over a number of years, even a little bit of job and a little bit of reading on your own, and possibly a class here and there. There are all kinds of interesting examples of how you can build either better performance at work or more satisfaction with your life by considering these other options of pursuing your interests, your personal interests, or particular skills. So this is the catch-all, and maybe for some people it's the place to start because it's easy, it's inexpensive, and it gets you into that frame of mind of learning is important. So I'll start right here and then build from that. And so with that, if anybody has any questions, we can pause for a minute. Okay, then let's turn it back to Anne.
All right. Thank you, Bob. So let's go on to now something I mentioned earlier when talking about resources. This is very important. How do I pay for my continuing education? As Bob just mentioned, there are a lot of things you can do that are actually free. Often little classes online, little helpful things. She's right, I do love YouTube videos. There's a lot of things you can learn for free, particularly online these days. But if you're going to seek a more formal education or something that actually requires that you pay for it, how are you going to pay for it? So the first thing you can do especially if your continuing education is going to benefit your skills as an employee, which means that it's going to benefit your employer. Ask your employer, you know, look, I already have this level of skill, but, you know, I could also help out with something else, you know, in a different department. If I had another level of skill, would you pay for me to train, maybe to take a community college class for a year to get a certification in something else, right? If it benefits your employer, there's every chance your employer, especially some of the bigger employers these days, will almost certainly pay for some or all of that continuing education. You can also apply for federal financial aid in any kind of formal program. This is usually applicable. So especially, for example, if you're planning to go to college or community college, definitely look into the federal financial aid program. So just Google that and it will come up with all sorts of things. You can also seek private student loans. Now you can get these from a variety of places. Sometimes the church, if you belong to a church, a nonprofit organization, and so on. So you can always get a loan. A loan is not usually the most difficult thing to get, but we always caution, be very, very careful if you're actually borrowing money, that you understand how you're going to be able to repay it, okay? Because it does have to be repaid. And usually that will start as soon as you've finished with the program that you're taking. So just be very careful with any kind of private student loan that you can repay it and then you're not borrowing more than you can afford. Okay, and the other obvious place to ask about personal loans is at your bank. And sometimes places like churches may actually give you a scholarship. So Google scholarships for whatever industry you're interested in and apply for program or industry scholarships and grants. Okay, this can be something local, like as I just said, your church or a local nonprofit, or it can be something more general from a sort of a larger entity. But if you Google scholarships, you will generally find all sorts of things online that you might be able to apply for, okay? And if you attended our Paying for College session, you'll know that there are all sorts of things out there. There is actually a whole wealth of information about scholarships online. Some of those scholarships can be quite small, but usually when you apply for scholarships, it doesn't mean that you can't apply for another one. Okay, sometimes grants, you can only get one grant, but scholarships, it usually doesn't matter. Anything that you feel you can apply for that is applicable to you, certainly go ahead and apply for it, okay? So that's a great source of free money because scholarships do not have to be repaid. And then again, as I just mentioned, be very careful with repayment. Money that you borrow has to be repaid. It can be very helpful if people who are lending you money, like the bank, will set you up with a payment plan, okay? Because you might get that qualification and that might lead to you earning more money, as Bob said, in your job or in a slightly different job. But also it may take a while for you to really feel the effect of earning a little bit more money. So be very careful again about how you're going to repay your loan. Make sure that you're going to have enough money and not get yourself in a big financial difficulty. Okay, so money is very important here, but again, there can be free money out there. Certainly look for that first and always look for scholarships, especially if you're undertaking a formal continuing education program. So on the next slide, where do I actually go for these continuing education classes or training? All right, we've talked a lot about all sorts of things, but how do we actually find all this training or education? So many employers, especially the bigger employers, will actually have their own training programs. So certainly ask about those, because almost always these bigger companies encourage their employees to take these advanced training programs. Okay, it's good for you and it's good for your employer. We will be telling you to Google a lot of things. That's a great way to find information. So Google trade schools in the field of your interest, okay? And if it's a particular job, like for example, an electrician or a plumber, that sort of thing, Google the local labor unions. They will often have apprenticeship programs, which are really great if you can get into them, because it does mean that you get paid while you work and learn on the job. Okay, so local labor unions, if there's a local union for the field of interest that you want to join, then there will certainly be a lot of information that you can Google there. And apprenticeships are a wonderful way to go. They can be fairly competitive, but well worth applying for if you can find them. And then just Google generally what your field of interest is. Okay, there's all sorts of websites, YouTube videos, and oftentimes just informational websites that will point you to other great areas of resource for you. Okay, so I know Googling can take quite a lot of time sometimes, but it can be well worth your while. There's a lot of information out there on the web. You just have to find it. Certainly, especially if you're considering somewhat more formal education, as Bob mentioned, go to the websites of these community colleges. Our local one here is Montgomery College. Adjacent or nearby counties have their own community colleges, like Prince George's County will have Prince George's County Community College, and so on. Okay, so every county has its own community college. Certainly Google those, because they have great websites. Also, if you're interested in Montgomery County Community College, there is a whole little office in the upstairs part of the Gaithersburg Library. They actually have a little mini office there. So certainly if you're near the Gaithersburg Library and interested in Montgomery College, you can just go upstairs to the second floor in the library and speak to somebody. Okay, that's another great resource. And also, don't forget about the nonprofit websites. They often have great links to all sorts of other information. So of course, the Literacy Council of Montgomery County, our own website, definitely go to that one. The public libraries are a fantastic source of information. Or as I just mentioned, you can certainly go into any of the libraries in person, talk to the reference librarian. They are always super, super helpful, and they have a lot of information that they can give you, or help they can give you in getting started with various resources. And then, you know, even other places, we could have listed a lot of things, but we listed here the Smithsonian Museums. So again, another very interesting website with a lot of links and a lot of further information. Okay, so again, we always recommend that you Google things, get yourself as informed as possible, because the better informed you are, the better decision that you're going to make about what kind of continuing education is best for you. And also, very importantly, you have the time and the money to undertake. Okay, so on the next slide, we're just giving you a couple of very good websites. The first one is the Literacy Council's website, and you'll see /computer skills and digital literacy. So that will tell you a lot about our digital literacy programs. And then the other one is the Montgomery College website for continuing education. So again, these are just two websites of many, many that are on the internet, but good places to start. Okay, so on the next slide, I'm going to give you a little summary of what we covered today, and then I'll pause and ask for any more questions. So as a reminder, and don't forget, you will all be receiving the PowerPoint. Raul will send it to you during this coming week. So today we talked about continuing education. We answered that important question, what exactly is continuing education and what are the benefits? Why should I think about continuing education? And is it right for me? Or is it right for me now? Is it something I should think about, but maybe not until next year? How is continuing education different than college? What kinds of continuing education are there? Remember, it can be formal, it can be informal, it can be a longer program, it can be just a quick hour of YouTube, or it can be an actual formal class, one class or a whole year of classes. Very important, how do I pay for it? Okay, please don't undertake anything without knowing how you're going to pay for it. And then finally, where do I go? There are all sorts of places. And again, we recommend you start with Googling a few things. But if you want more formal education, certainly look at the community colleges to start with. They all have great websites. And as a reminder, next week, we'll be talking all about learning a trade, which will include things like where to go for apprenticeships and what trade schools are and how you really start and make sure that you can afford learning a trade. So that concludes the formal part of our presentation today. Does anyone have either any questions for us or any comments? We just have a couple of minutes left. And please also remember, you can also, if a question pops in your head tomorrow, you can always email Raul and ask him your question, and he'll either answer or, if appropriate, send it to us, and we will be happy to answer any questions. Okay, today is not your last opportunity to do that. All right. So does anybody have anything, any comments? Otherwise, I will hand things back to Raul and Tremaine.
Thank you so much. This was such a great course today, a wonderful session. We thank you all for joining us today and participating and asking the questions. You guys flooded the workshop today with a lot of wonderful questions. If you find, again, that you need additional questions asked, you can reach out to me. Raul, could you place my email address in the chat? You can look in the chat and you could get my email address, and I will be so gladly to assist you with any questions that you may have regarding this workshop or any future workshops that we may have. My email address, if it's not, there it is. He placed it into the chat for me. Tremaine at lcmcmd.org. Feel free to email me at any time with your questions. And we look forward to you all joining us next Wednesday, the same time, 11:30 until 12:30 for our next workshop. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of the day.